G'day listeners, you are listening to the Natives Rouseabout podcast. I'm your host Michael, and today we have our Empire Day podcast special with a couple of guests from across the Anglosphere joining us to discuss the British Empire and its legacy, as well as nationalist movements in their own homelands. So from Canada, we have Connor, who's chairman of the Loyalist Assembly. How are you going, mate?
Good, yourself?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. And from the UK, we have Jerome from the Homeland Party. And how are you?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you. I think I won the lottery with the time zones.
Yeah.
Time of day. So I'm happy. I'm happy for that.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. And lastly, we have our very own Matthew Grant, National Governor of the ANA, joining us as well. How are you, Grant?
Yeah, good, mate. Yes, indeed, it is early morn.
Yeah. Got to smash those coffees. Today I'm glad for Melbourne coffee culture and my golden honeycomb syrup, long black. But enough of that stuff. How about we have Jerome tell us a bit about Homeland Party and what you guys do.
So Homeland, we are a nationalist party. So we are not a civic nationalist party. I may add a real nationalist party. We stand up for the ethnic interests of the English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish within the United Kingdom. And we started on May 8th, 2023, and we were registered after a little bit of a struggle, but we got there in the end with the Electoral Commission at the end of January of last year. So we've been officially registered for about a year now. Our focus really different from all the other nationalist parties or parties that claim to be nationalists in the UK, is that we follow quite a strict doctrine of community politics. What that means is, of course, is that we actually get in on the ground and sort out problems on the local level, build that trust with our local communities, and then, and only then, ask for their vote for, a national level. But that's the way we think we can build power. And we've been quite successful with it so far. Obviously, recently we had blew up a little bit online. If you follow us on X, there was a lot of pro-Palestinian graffiti on a beauty spot in the Yorkshire Moors. We sent a team up there pretty swiftly to clean that up. And we did actually find out the local council knew about the graffiti for 2 months, and they didn't bother to lift a finger on that either. And so, that's why we're there as a Homeland Party. That's what our local teams do. That's what our local councillors do. Our parish councillors, our community councillors, we get the job done on, or when our own incompetent councils fail. But that's really what we're about, really, is that building up at that grassroots level and taking it forward. Because, other nationalist parties, they throw themselves in a by-election for those, and I'm not sure you might use the same term in Australia, essentially when a member of parliament steps down outside of a general election, they have a by-election. And, parties throw themselves at those and they get 0.8 to 0.9% of the vote, make a fool of themselves, waste a load of money. That's never going to be our strategy. We're about building our community roots. That's enough about the Homeland Party.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And it's always good to hear about different models of organising and how people go about it. And I'm just thinking of a party that we have in Australia that's kind of recently started up. We have this billionaire guy, Clive Palmer, who kind of is like a $2 store Donald Trump, basically. He tries to ride the coattails of the Trump wave, but he's not particularly good at it. And he's just had this issue where his previous party, which was United Australia Party, he deregistered it during between the election cycles because he just couldn't be bothered trying to actually put together some sort of grassroots party structure and work with people. And so now he's had the way that our system works. He's not been able to re-register it because you can't do that if you've deregistered it yourself between cycles. So he's gone and he's bought another party called Trumpet of Patriots.
Trumpet of Patriots.
Yeah.
Oh my word.
Not good.
Goodness.
It's pretty cringe. Yeah, so that's some of the quality of the stuff we're dealing with down here. But Connor, maybe you can tell us about Canada and Loyalist Assembly.
For sure. The Loyalist Assembly of Canada is a political action committee or a pressure group, not officially registered at the moment, but currently our strategy. Well, sorry, let me step back a second. So the history of the Loyalist Assembly is actually quite connected to the Homeland Party, because we first started out as just a group of young men who would run around at different protests and whatnot, until we had the foreign, what's the word? The international affairs fellow from the Homeland Party reach out to us, Martin Kuziel, and he kind of helped put us on the path towards a little bit more professionalism, and we've worked with a lot of local people to try and figure out the best way forward. A big difference between Canada and the United Kingdom in terms of our electoral politics is essentially nowhere in Canada has municipal parties. You can do it in the United States. You can have a municipal party. You can do it in the UK. But in Canada, you can't have a municipal party. So that makes things a little bit more difficult for trying to do stuff like community politics, because MLA elections are quite difficult, as you have these very ingrained bipartisan systems there, and then federal election is basically a non-starter. So essentially what we're trying to do with that is we have our pressure group, and we are trying to get people to work together in terms of endorsing certain candidates, getting out there and door knocking, communicating with people, and engaging in the community in that way, but not so much in a direct electoral way like the Homeland Party is doing. Because broadly, the big issue broadly as well is that on various different levels of Canadian politics, we don't really have a nationalist party or anyone claiming to be nationalist, period. You have the uni party of the Tories, the NDP, and the Liberals. And they're all essentially advocating for the same thing: mass immigration. They don't even try to, I know in the United Kingdom, Conservatives try to hide that they're pro-mass immigration, but the Conservatives in Canada don't even try to hide it. And then the only party that even feigns opposition is the People's Party of Canada, and it is run by people who are schizophrenic. So that's kind of the issues we're facing in Canada, is we don't have a nationalist party, and starting one is immensely difficult in terms of crossing that area. For even a provincial party, you would be covering the same amount of land as basically the entire United Kingdom, and that's for any province. So that's what the Loyalist Assembly is, just trying to find individual candidates and individuals, like maybe independents or fringe members of certain political parties, and working with them on a more individual level, and just trying to establish yourself a little bit more cohesively. Now, we are very new. We only really started to get things going shortly before the 2024 Homeland Conference. So we're just trying to work on getting everything kind of situated and off the ground.
Yeah, no, sounds interesting. And it kind of, some of the stuff you're saying reminds me of a group we have in Australia called the British Australia Community, which also has that sort of more Anglophile loyalist outlook, I suppose, and they also function. They're on the one hand like a community group that position themselves within multiculturalism in terms of, oh, we're just like, you know, the Indian community or the Chinese community or whatever. But then they are running these sort of pressure campaigns to try and counter things like renaming of monuments and stuff. So I'm sure you probably have that issue in Canada as well, like renaming things to,
Absolutely.
I don't know, Indian names or something. Yeah, so
that's stuff.
oh no, go ahead if you've wanted to say something.
Oh, I was just saying that's definitely a big issue. I agree.
Yeah, yeah.
We call it sensible nationalism. But the need for it to, we've got to make our case to the public in a sane and sensible way. I think that's probably what some of the COVID populist movements, for lack of a better term, kind of never understood. As in, you've got to meet the people where they are, especially in our parliamentary systems, the way they are at the moment, that we all of our countries pretty much have the same basic political system. I mean, in Canada, the Canadian Parliament is nearly, the interior of the House of Commons is nearly indistinguishable, and I get sometimes taken aback how similar it is when I see it on the television. But yeah, that's what we need: is sensible nationalism.
Yeah,
not sort of pandering to weird internet fringes. Not obviously we want to keep to our principles. Never sell out your principles, but you've got to put it in a way that people can understand.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I said when you're advocating for nationalism, a big thing you need is, well, I always say is, you know, neckties, not neck gaiters. You know, because that's the big thing is you know, a lot of these guys. I personally believe now. I don't know if this is maybe a contentious point, but I personally believe that one person face out is worth 100 with face masks, because that person can build a rapport with the community. That person can, you know, be a personality. It's not just a masked goons in the eyes of the people. That's just what they're going to see it as. Goons, and it makes it easier for the media to dehumanize you.
There's a long form discussion to be had on that. I definitely think it adds to the credibility of your argument, but maybe that's a subject for another day. Let's kick off into this discussion on Empire Day. Michael, if you'd like to start with your poetry section.
Yep. So the just following our normal structure, we've got the poetry segment, and given that we're talking about Empire today, and we'll go into that a little bit more in the next bit, but I've picked out a classical poem of Empire, not an Australian one, which is a bit unusual, but I've got Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, which was in 1899 dedicated to the US on the Philippines. Originally, he wrote it, I believe, in relation to the British Empire, but then he wanted to sort of include the Americans in this as well. So sort of a pan-Anglosphere poem in that respect. But here we go. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread, go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humour, slowly toward the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen peoples shall weigh your gods anew. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days. The lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise, comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. All right, so that is the White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. And from my perspective, in many ways, it's sort of I mean, if people look at this poem now, and I don't know if you guys came across this one in school or not, but it's often seen as a sort of like a central text of empire. And when people talk about, the history of colonialism and all of that sort of stuff, the sort of the poem they often turn to introduce a lot of those ideas is this poem. But really, when we look at it, you can sort of see the seeds of the later, I guess, leftist anti-colonial mentality in here as well. I mean, it's kind of one of the things that he's targeting in the poem. But what do we think about this one, guys? Jerome, did you come across this one before?
Yes, I have done. Yeah, as well as a lot of Kipling's poetry. I mean, he's probably, unfortunately for Kipling, I like him a lot. But he has been pretty much purged from all academic or otherwise cultural schools, etc. I believe he literally has poetry painted. His poems were painted over on the walls of university. I think it was his poem. I think it's called "If."
Yeah, that's a big
and it
one.
was literally painted over by and replaced with this crap from a poet called Maya Angelou, and it was essentially about ethno-narcissism for her African people. If it was how beautiful she is and how valid she is and how wonderful she is simply for being black. And I was like, well, okay, I'm not sure, and you take that thing, White Man's Burden there, that poem, and you compare the two, and that's what is Kipling really saying there. He's not saying it's not really a. Well, I suppose there is an element of ethno-narcissism there, but not in the same way, as in it's more like, well, we're doing this to help you, we're doing this because it's what you need, and we're doing this because we want to see you be better. And with Maya Angelou, it's more like, I'm already good, I'm already fine, I'm already brilliant, and I don't need to change a thing. It's a very different attitude in the same, but obviously, but I think both are quite imperialist poems. Obviously, because Maya Angelou, I believe she's either American or British. Obviously lives in a Western country, and in a way, she does have that imperialist mindset of, well, I'm better than the Europeans, I'm better than the white Americans, simply because I'm black. But again, that's not the same attitude that Kipling has in that poem, is it? It's a very more, I'm here to help you. Now, Of course, obviously, the British Empire wasn't totally innocent and wholesome chungus. Obviously, there was economics and trade imbalances and whatever, right? But at the end of the day, you look at India today, was where Kipling lived most of his life, I believe. It was irreparably made better by British colonialism. I know that's going to be a very controversial statement amongst the liberals, and then clutch their pearls. But at the end of the day, our colonialism was good, and this kind of reverse colonialism of today is a universal bad.
Yeah, and we can almost think there's a bit of is that your audio, Grant, that's crackling a bit?
Apologies.
I'm just gonna mute a little bit. Yeah, no, but we can kind of look at the poem today and ask whether it was even really worth it as well, I guess, because you have all these things, the ports you shall not enter, the roads you shall not tread, go mark them go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. And it's like, was it necessarily worth it to pour out all this, this blood and for the sake of, these places that have then turned against us, as he says, the blame of those he better, the hate of those he guard. And obviously at the time it was a very different mentality, and you can see in this poem it's sort of running on the tail end of the Enlightenment thinking, where we're all progressing to one sort of common advancement of humanity, and sort of the white people are just helping the others catch up. And we live in a very different age now, I think, where we can have a bit more of a pluralistic perspective on where different countries are going. So I think that's kind of something important to break away from that Enlightenment mentality, that singular focus on all of mankind as heading in the same direction. What do you think, Connor?
Well, obviously, in Canada, the poem I did learn that poem in school. It was used for me to actually introduce. Interestingly, it was used to introduce apartheid, specifically for some reason. But I think, in terms of Canada, that poem has a much more interesting place in the history of residential schools. I don't know if you are very familiar with that.
I've heard of it. The mass graveyard hoax thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And it was a hoax. No corpses have been found. But more broadly, I think I will agree on one point with the Liberals, is that I think residential schools were a bad thing, but not for the reasons they purport, not because I don't generally agree with the conception that it was wrought with this insanity and abuse and death. I think more so, I will agree with the premise that it was negative because it kind of, how do I quantify what I'm saying here? Well, we in Canada, we have these treaties. We have these very firmly written treaties with the Native Americans. For as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow, these treaties shall be true. And that marks the territory, which has these, quasi-independent little areas of land in parts all throughout Canada. But residential schools, what they did is they brought large numbers of Native Americans out of their treaty lands and into these other parts of Canada to try and acclimatize them to Anglo-Canadian, and in some parts, I do believe, French-Canadian society. And this has led to a lot of issues where the Native American population is the most addicted to drugs, the most homeless, because, quite frankly, now this might be controversial, I don't think groups of people can necessarily be fully assimilated into the societies of other groups of people. I will never assimilate into being an Arab. Lawrence of Arabia, even though he was like as close as you could be technically, he was never fully assimilated into being an Arab. And to that same extent, I don't think that a Native American could ever fully assimilate into being an Anglo-Canadian or a French-Canadian, just because of predispositions and ways of life that we have. And I think that kind of almost violating these treaties, violating these parallel societies that were designed to avoid such a fate, because of this idea of the white man's burden that we need to ennoble the savage, it kind of has caused all of these conflicts that didn't really need to be there. And that's why you see these advocacy groups throughout Canada saying that, the government needs to essentially take over the reservations and give them an Anglo quality of life, even if they don't realize that's what they're saying. That's what they're saying is they want the government to come in and give them an Anglo quality of life in an Anglo way, which isn't what they need, you know?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We have the same thing in Australia with our Aboriginal populations out in the outback. I mean, we have constantly they talk about the government talks about the need to close the gap. You know, Aboriginals are the most, have the most issues around child sexual abuse. They've got the most, imprisonment and all this stuff. And it is about trying to essentially assimilate them into this one homogenous idea. Which, I mean, I think you would find people on the far left would talk about that as well as a sort of still a residue, perhaps, of this mentality of the poem and the need to assimilate everyone into this kind of it's not white per se ideal, but this one conception of civilization. Whereas I do know some Aboriginal guys who are much more like, no, actually, we just need to go our own separate ways. And I think that's an important thing. I think it's what we need to do is put down the white man's burden at this point, because there's no way that we can continue this at all. It's destroying our cultures, it's destroying our societies, and it's not really helping anyone else. They're still resentful. They still hate us, and the gap never closes. Like, no matter what our government does, in order to try to close this gap, they'll go out to these communities and they'll build houses. And they'll close the local bottle shops or put restrictions on them. But you come back a year later or whatever, and the houses have been completely trashed and all this stuff. So they just get free stuff handed to them, and it ends up reverting, I suppose, back to what it was. And I don't think there's any way to deal with that other than to let them develop along their own course. So yeah, I think putting down the white man's burden. Sorry, go ahead.
That's the exact same thing that happens on the reservations here in Canada. You'll have these very massive developments made by the government, and then usually they are bankrolled by the Canadian government, but then under the control of they're called the band councils, which also derive their authority from. Not from the Canadian government, but actually directly from the king. So the band councils and the parliament their authority derived directly from the crown, as opposed to being from the Canadian government. But so the Canadian government will bankroll these developments, and about 60% of the funds from these development projects will be embezzled by the band councils, spent on a new car, a new house, all that. And then they will throw whatever remaining 40% at the project, and it will be done wrong. And then the Canadian government takes the blame and has to come in and do it for them, which this happened. A very major instance of this happened in Manitoba, I want to say about 10 years ago. And they repeat it constantly. They say that the Canadian government denies Native Americans clean water, when it was the Canadian government that gave money to the band councils to make this water treatment plant, and then they just didn't do it.
Yeah, common story. Jerome, how about back in the UK? Because for you, it's a bit different. I mean, the UK is the ancestral homeland, I suppose, of all these different branch settler states that have been set up, and we've all kind of gone in our own, directions to some extent. As you said, there are commonalities, of course, but for you guys, I guess this is not so much an issue, except that perhaps there might be a bit of divide and conquer going on between, say, the Welsh and the Scottish and the English, perhaps. Is that the case in England? Do they try and do an anti-imperialist thing from the perspective of these groups that were arguably subjugated by the English or whatever, or is it mostly still kind of just the empire in reverse of people coming from India and elsewhere?
Definitely the latter. I think obviously there's a case for Scottish independence. Obviously there's a big discussion there, but in terms of, are Scottish people victims of the British Empire? Are Welsh people victims of the British Empire? More so than English people? No. I mean, particularly the Scots as well. There are, lots of Scots are doing plenty of, dirty deals, even more so, some might say, than the English. I know some of my Scottish friends.
We're going to red pill our
that,
audience on the Eternal Scott, David Hume, Adam Smith.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh dear. But yeah, they in terms of, I don't want to sound too sort of leftist here, but in a way, the empire caused class. It was far more class based in, and so, for example, you had government spending millions of pounds, or back then it was millions, because goodness knows what, the billions probably, on wars trying to stop slavery in the Sudan. And of course, General Gordon, I think he's a great hero, and he died a heroic death, but his death caused an 18-year war in the Sudan to try and pacify it, called the Mahdist Revolt. Goodness knows how much money and lives are wasted for that, when we could have been improving the material conditions of men and women, forced into, very poor conditions, in coal mines, in cotton mills. Things like cotton lung was a common ailment in places like Lancashire. Obviously, in South Wales, you had mining accidents that would kill hundreds of men and boys in one go. I believe in Sengenneth, 300 men died in just from one single blast in a mine. So that's the thing, really. It's a it's a class thing, and so much money and effort was poured into, especially in the late part of the 19th century, into crap holes in Africa, if you don't mind me saying. Like, completely, there's no economic worth to a place like the Sudan, and money was being poured hand over fist to throw into that quagmire. And of course, the Boer War as well, another example that, a war that just didn't need to be fought. For what purpose? For pride, for arrogance, because someone wanted to build a railway through from Cape to Cairo. Just and meanwhile, the industrial classes of Britain were being pretty abhorrently treated. Now, those conditions to get better, but again, only after World War One was there significant improvement in labour conditions. And again, that's because the government really had no choice. It was either that or socialist revolution. But yeah, that's my view. It's the British Empire is two sides of a coin for me. It's and in terms of obviously the legacy of today, what's it used for and invoked for? Again, as you said, it's to bring in really. It's difficult, because my view is that liberals in places like London, I don't want to pick on London. London's a lovely place, but there is a certain sort of metropolitan attitude of, and I think deep down it's like, well, the empire never truly falls because now you have the empire at home. It's like the meme of, oh, I want the British Empire, and mum turns around and says, oh, well, yeah, don't worry, we have the British Empire at home. And it turns out it's like 3 a.m. Pakistani takeaways and calls to prayer, and King Charles, and we can get onto him later if you like, doing Ramadan fast feasts in Windsor Castle. And it's like, oh yeah, well, I suppose that is still the British Empire. You have your Indians, your Nigerians, Pakistanis, all sorts. Every different group that we conquered is now moved back to the country. So it's just like, so the empire never fell. It's just been internalized. But that, obviously that's a bit of a silly thing, because the liberals, they do think, obviously, like, one of the things topical in the news at the moment, I'm not sure if you guys have heard about it, the British Indian Ocean Territory otherwise known as the Chagos Islands. I'm not might have come up in the Australian news.
Yeah, well, I've seen it, but yeah.
Yeah. So we are giving that away. We're not only giving it away, we are paying Mauritius for the privilege to lease out an American military base. It was not one of our military bases. And the main reasoning for it is because because the Foreign Office think that we need to keep Africa on side in the global, race against China and Russia. So to keep Africa on side, we've got to make sure that we don't have any outstanding diplomatic disputes with African countries. So therefore, we've got to sign on to this Chagos deal to make the African Union happy. The problem is the African Union is never going to be happy with the United Kingdom. As you said earlier, these countries hate us for good reasons or for bad reasons, right or wrong. They just dislike us intensely because of the history. They're never going to get over that. They literally have their Independence Day celebrations celebrating the liberation from the empire. So pleasing these, you can never please these countries through weakness, But that is the legacy of the British Empire, is guilt amongst our ruling classes, and incredible amount of guilt. Obviously you have people like the Trevelyan family. I can't remember. I think she's called Laura Trevelyan. She, because her ancestor owned slaves in the island of Demerara in the Caribbean, she's given away half of her family's wealth to British, people who were descended from or Grenada, as part of the nation of Grenada. I can't remember quite the details, but she's giving away half her family's wealth. She can do what she likes with her wealth, but it goes to show you the level of guilt. It's like, yeah, you giving away your money to this country, this probably fairly corrupt country, is not going to do a thing at all, apart from sort of purge you of guilt. But even then, you'll still be guilty. But that's the problem we have. It's the legacy of that we did do wrong, but it makes no sense, because again, even if you were to give away everything that you owned, you give away the shirt off your back, these countries and these people are still going to dislike you.
I mean, we are giving up the shirts off our backs effectively. That's with
very true.
our countries. True. So, and I've yet to see much gratitude from the people who have come across rather a lot of entitlement. So,
well, that reminds me of when John A. Macdonald's family home. John A. Macdonald founded Canada, of course, in 1867. They reopened his house with this new exhibit to talk about the complicated history of John A. Macdonald's past or whatever. One of the ladies who spoke was the chairman of the Ontario Black History Society, and she was saying how the premiership of John A. Macdonald was when all of these people of African descent were coming over to Canada via the Underground Railroad to escape American slavery. But, and I'm quoting her directly here, Canada, like the United States, was steeped in racism, colonialism, white supremacy, and other legacies of enslavement, even though slavery had been outlawed 33 years prior to John A. Macdonald's premiership. And they were coming to Canada to escape literal slavery, as opposed to the quote, legacies of enslavement. So you grant them liberation from slavery, and they still complain about the legacies of enslavement 33 years after it had been entirely outlawed.
Yeah, you'll never make them happy. Grant, I believe you wanted to say something, and perhaps you can take it away and go into the next section that you prepared to.
No worries. Yeah, no, it's been an interesting discussion, and I wrapped my head around this poem like 3 or 4 times, and I've really struggled. Like, I'm usually a bit of a poetry nerd, but this one I quite struggled to actually get the thrust of the poem until like the last time I read it, and I won't obviously re-enliven the poem, but I think there's some discussion which is kind of missed. Obviously, Kipling seems to be pointing to this kind of altruistic imperialism where it's all about rescuing all these, savages, these pagans from their own misery and famine and all that. And obviously, I think there was a slice of that at play during the peak of European imperialism. But I think what's sorely missing, or what at least I can't see in this poem, is that kind of contrast with what was clearly a financial venture by the wealthiest classes. I mean, if we talk about the British Empire, after the wealthiest elements of the British aristocracy, at the same time they were clearing the commoners off the common land and clearing the Highlanders off their ancestral homes to create industrial farming properties. At the same time, they were, recruiting en masse under coercion, if not slavery, enormous hordes of Africans or Asians to create these kind of new plantation slave economies in Africa and India, that they went to China and got everyone addicted to opium, and the Chinese crown was trying to stop the opium addiction, and the European powers, by force of might, for financial interests, kept them crushed. The empires, the East India Company, the Dutch East India, like tea and spice trade, off the back of cannons, coercion, and the exploitation of kind of slave labor. So obviously, at the same time, there was great crimes being committed against the commoners of the United Kingdom in terms of the clearances and the enclosure acts. At the same time, there was this mass exploitation of kind of Asiatics and Africans. And obviously there was some gain to them, obviously inheriting our systems of government and law and having these, no more mass famines and starvation, being given medicine. And I mean, the population of Africa before and after this kind of imperial exercise speaks for itself. If it was just a purely genocidal regime, we wouldn't have any problems in Africa, but their populations expanded and blown up, and not of their own accord, but by the introduction of modern medicine and Western charity and all the rest of it. But the last thing I'll add to all of this is there's discussion about, there was also mention of the Boer War. One thing that's commonly missed is that at the time of the Boer War, there was an enormous gold rush in South Africa and the boundary regions that were being worked by the Afrikaans. And after the Boer War, and the Afrikaans were put in concentration camps and driven off their land, industrialists from the English business interests mass introduced Chinese laborers to South Africa for the purposes of exploiting gold and undercutting the wages of Afrikaners who would work a white man's wage and had unionized. So there's another angle to the Boer War that John Norton, who was a member of the Sydney Legislative Assembly, had to talk about. But ultimately, with all this imperialism stuff discussed, the thing that really grinds my gears is clearly there were injustices punished, like exploitation and suffering inflicted on all these countries, as well as some benefits. However, the attempts at reparations are being paid for by the working classes of white countries, which themselves were being punished, exploited, driven off their own ancestral commons, and by the wealthy. So it's like this game where the imperial financial interests have simultaneously caused harm to the working class of white countries and coloured countries. They've walked away with the loot, and now the working class of white countries through the taxation to the state of paying reparations to coloured countries who have also benefited from our charity over the years. So it's just a complete mess, this white man's burden business. The imperial exercise and the suffering caused by it continues on. And I think the imperial system, as Jerome, you rightfully said, I think it does live on. It's just changed its form. It's now this kind of international finance capitalism has assumed the new role of empire. And now you have this kind of freedom of movement, and you bring the slave labor home to your own country instead of dealing with it in a foreign land. So it's quite a fascinating subject. But I will move us on to the next subject. And the main thrust of the podcast today was to discuss Empire Day and the history of it to some extent, and where does that sit in the current modern day, and where does our shared ancestry and shared political heritage, I suppose, sit in modernity. So for those who haven't heard of Empire Day before, it was traditionally held on the 24th of May as a commemoration of the British Empire, clearly. It was celebrated in Australia. Now, I can't speak to Canada. I'll get Connor's view on that shortly. But it was celebrated in Australia amongst other events on the calendar, like Foundation Day or, what later became Australia Day and ANA Day. It was a focus on, that connection to Australia within the British Empire itself. And obviously the Australian Natives Association, which was formed in 1871, spent a lot of time over the decades trying to cultivate an Australian first sentimentality amongst the colonies, and to increase the reputation and the prestige of the currency lads and lasses, those native-born people of Australia that were of British stock. And there's some interesting research I was doing in the lead up to this Empire Day podcast, just having a look at, what was the ANA's position, I suppose, on the celebration of Empire Day. Because even in contemporary times, we're constantly challenged with a discussion about what is the correct balance between having a nativist ideology, which is this kind of organic Australian ethnic ethnogenesis, loyalty first, versus also acknowledging our British heritage, and what level of loyalties do you have to your ancestral homeland when compared to your current home that's been your bloodstock, that's given you life for generations in Australia. Some interesting commentary from the ANA historically is the summary view appears to be, at least from the turn of the 20th century, the ANA did celebrate Empire Day, and there was one discussion where an ANA branch governor, as reported in 1908, discussed that Empire Day was valuable in the sense that, it was twofold valuable. On one hand, there's this acknowledgement of the deep down in their hearts love for a land which gave their fathers birth, which nothing can estrange. It's the cradle of our race. It's our ancestral homeland. And then this other element, which is this idea of the preservation of the White Australia policy and the preservation of Australia's sovereignty at that time relied on the British Navy. Obviously, we were on the other side of the world, hadn't yet cultivated a significant force of arms of our own accord. And, the tidal wave of Asian growth to our north, the British Empire was seen as the bulwark to guard us from Asian aggression, I suppose. So I think that the ANA did celebrate Empire Day with probably, I think, what I think is more of a balanced, fair approach to the matter, which is not necessarily surrendering our Australian interests or loyalties or diminishing the uniqueness of our Australian ethnogenesis, but also acknowledging that the Australian ethnic group is descended very much from the British Isles, and that we have these unbreakable, what our founding father Henry Parkes would call the kindred ties, or the crimson threads of blood to our British ancestors, which I think some people in contemporary Australian politics miss now. Obviously, there was a mention of the British Australia community before, and they very much see themselves as British people in Australia, where we see ourselves as Australians of British descent, which is a very, it sounds kind of semantic, but it's a very significant difference, because over the hundreds of years of settlement life in this country, there has been a unique cultural genesis, which has been made up of principally British people. But we have become a unique ethnic group, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to completely break ties with your ancestors. Like, I'm very proud of my Scottish heritage, and, you know, I think often of my family's lives on the banks of the Spey and Avon River in Moray, Scotland, and I think of the life on the moors, and I think that our political and legal and social heritage and our principles of, you know, Magna Carta and labourism and these ideas of ethnic solidarity very much stem from the British Isles, and it's very fruitless to disconnect ourselves from it. Whilst at the same time, I think there's a discussion to be had about, you know, our roles that we played practically in the empire. Before the fall of the empire, obviously we mentioned the Boer War and we've mentioned the Sudan War. You might not know that more than half of the soldiers that fought in the Sudan War to bring down the Mahdi were Australian men from New South Wales. We fought in the Boer War. You wouldn't know that. Shout out to the brave Australians that crushed the Mahdi. But the Boer War, Australian men were the only men with, you know, enough strength to bring down the Afrikaans, because like us, they were built colonial men on the frontier, strong, raised on the fruits of hardship. And in the First World War, we had probably, I think, amongst the highest, if not the highest, per capita loss of men and life in the entire world. Given we were on the entire other side of the world, we emptied out our frontier towns of all their youthful blood, left behind widows, and basically we've never recovered from the First World War. If you go and look out in regional Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, there is towns that were before World War One thriving rural districts and communities, and ever since the losses of the war, they've never rebuilt, they've never recovered, and they've just slowly declined and died. Now, obviously, there's economic factors there too, but the blood loss of our contribution to the First World War, which ostensibly was to support the British, you know, has been a great cost to us. But anyway, I've had my long form rant now. I might let Michael have some comments about what I was on about.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with much of what you said, and you know, the ANA always did, as you say, have that balance between, I suppose, empire loyalism and a patriotic Australian sentiment and loyalty to our own country and our own unique direction. And of course, those things were, as you mentioned, tied together significantly with even the idea of World War One. Like, I think the rallying cry was sort of go off to France to fight for a white Australia, because we need to keep the empire together, so that so that they can protect us from perhaps the Japanese or the Chinese. And of course, it was indeed the Japanese that we had to fight in World War II. And, you know, there were always more radicals on either side. You'd have radical nationalists in the Lawson strain who were, again, looking at the sort of, as you said, the Enclosure Acts and the persecution of the Commons, thought that the solution was to have a total break from Britain and establish a republic in Australia. And it'll be interesting to have a bit of a turn it to Connor in a moment, because I think Loyalist Assembly would be coming from a very more pro-monarchist angle, but I'll let him speak for himself. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important to, as he said, you had the financial empire of the bankers and their desire to exploit resources from around the world and have that cheap labor. And the Boer War, which has been mentioned, of course, resulted in the importation of Indians and other people from around the empire to work the mines there and replace the white labor. So, but I did read an interesting article at one point, and it was coming from a leftist angle, of course, and we've kind of talked about that a lot today. So it's funny that we can kind of adopt some elements of what I suppose mainstream academia has talked about, as long as we reframe it from a national standpoint and stay true to our principles. But the article, the name of it was something like "The Imperial Working Class Becomes White" or something like that. And obviously, the take there was that that whiteness is not, a biological reality or whatever, but it's an ideology. And obviously, we don't need to accept that. Obviously, there are clearly biological factors behind nations. I mean, a nation is a community that you were born into by blood and you belong to by blood. So that's all of course, perfectly fine. But then how that's conceived of, or how that's treated with, either importance or not, is an ideological matter. And that's kind of what this article was talking about. It was talking about how while the labour movement was kind of exported from the UK across the empire, it was in the frontier colonies like Australia, and then kind of related to Australia, the South Africa, that labour movement became strongly merged with the idea of a white identity and the need to defend workers from coloured labour, because it was in places like Australia where you had the threat of mass Asian immigration and replacement immigration effectively. And that got exported to South Africa as well. And then through that sort of process, it spread throughout the empire and went back to the UK as well. And there became an imperial sort of level solidarity of the working class behind this idea of a white working class that needs to defend itself against the exploitations or the importing of coloured labour by the financial elites. And I think that's something like we can take away as a positive aspect of empire, that there was always not just it wasn't just exploitation, but there was already the idea of the racial kinship across nations and sort of a shared interest, because as we all know, even though we're nationalists, we're in a global struggle, and the issues that face us they're the same issues, whether it's the UK, Canada, Australia. We're all facing the same demographic crisis, replacement, guilt mentality. And so even though we have our own unique struggles, we can have that solidarity across borders. And I think that's, one reason why we're having this podcast in the first place, just to talk about these shared interests. But maybe I'll turn it over to Connor, and you can talk a bit as well on that issue of, I suppose, nativism versus loyalism, or monarchy and republic, and that sort of thing.
Well, I'll start very briefly. Grant remarked about the contribution of the Australians during the Boer War. I just wanted to give a little bit of a humorous remark here. Lord Strathcona's horse, because I was in Calgary, which is the biggest city in Alberta, not too long ago, and I saw the monument there dedicated to Lord Strathcona's horse, which was the Canadian detachment in the Boer War. And there's this funny anecdote. It says when the commander of the Strathcona's force came to the South Africa, General Kitchener was astonished at the size of the Canadian soldiers. And the commander said, Sam Steele said, "My apologies, sir. I combed all of Canada, and these were the shortest men I could find." But as
Gold.
for the actual point, real. But as for the actual discussion regarding Empire Day, Canada has an interesting history with Empire Day. Originally, Empire Day and Victoria Day were the same holiday. But when the British Empire was effectively renamed Commonwealth of Nations, we moved Commonwealth Day to the first Monday of March, I believe, the second Monday of March. We moved Commonwealth Day to the second Monday of March to match with all of the rest of the nations, and renamed Empire Day to Victoria Day to celebrate her birthday. And Victoria Day is still a federal holiday. We all get it off. And noteworthily, is on both Commonwealth Day and Victoria Day, the second flag of Canada, which has not very often flown, is flown at every federal government institution. So the second flag is the Royal Union flag, otherwise known as the Union Jack. And fun fact, Canada is the only country in the world where it is a official national flag. According to British law, it's actually not the flag of Britain. So there's that little tidbit of knowledge. Union Jack is only officially recognized as a national flag in Canada. But that kind of plays into the thing with Canada. Is we're talking about, stuff like ethnogenesis and history of the relation between the empire and the people. What is unique about Canada in particular is Canada's ethnogenesis occurred in, I want to say, about 1780 with a group of people known as the United Empire Loyalists. They were expelled from the United States, and they all moved to Canada. About a little over 100,000 people moved to Canada, and they were the United Empire Loyalists. And I actually have a book all about them. And essentially, the Canadians who were already living there from the 1600s and whatnot got almost entirely displaced by this massive movement of American loyalists into Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, Ontario, and Quebec. Well, at that time, they were called Upper and Lower Canada, but you understand. So that was when our ethnogenesis occurred, was when hundreds of thousands of Americans fled America because of horrible atrocities that had been committed against the Loyalists. And the only thing that kept them with their property, their life, their livelihoods, was the British Empire and Lord Dorchester, who accepted the United Empire Loyalists into the Canadian colonies. So, being as the people group, which derives our ethnic origin from, has the word empire in their name, it's a little bit more difficult to make a divide between the British Empire and Canada. Furthermore, to that point, Confederation in Canada only occurred because we were afraid that following the American Civil War, they would try and invade us again. That was constantly reiterated by John A. Macdonald and the rest of the Fathers of Confederation throughout the process of Confederation. We, on two occasions, that was in 1812, as everyone knows, and a smaller Fenian raid. We have an Irishman in the chat. I understand it's got a different connotation in Britain, but in Canada, it's an explicitly solely negative thing. But the Fenian raids from America into Canada, there were these significant threats to Canada's sovereignty at the expense of another white Anglo English-speaking country. So, and now we're experiencing it again. We're experiencing constant threats to our existence, our people, from another white English-speaking group, which colors our perceptions of ourselves. Because if these people look similar to us, talk similar to us, have a common origin, but they want to subjugate us, what makes us different? And for most of Canada's history, the major thing that made us different was the monarchy, the parliamentary system, and the empire, because they couldn't invade us as long as we had the British Empire. And there's more to it than that, obviously, as well. I mean, you have stuff like the Komagata Maru incident, when a massive number of Indian British Empire, like people, extremists who want to bring down the British Empire, tried to mass immigrate to British Columbia on a Japanese ship and got turned around. And you had a lot of things like this, but then you also at the same time had people like George Exton Lloyd, a very significant figure in the Great March West, who built what was called a British utopian settlement, which was essentially an ethno-state inside of Canada. Still a city, by the way, called Lloydminster. But at every step, we have this idea where without the empire, we're just Americans. And we really, 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 really do not like Americans. And another aspect of that as well is the French. The French were not a problem for the majority of Canada's history. The blood of Wolfe and Montcalm, it fertilized the plains of Abraham and sprouted a rose and a lily, which came together to form a maple tree. That's a kind of poetic explanation. Our kind of shared tragedy at the conquering of Quebec during the 7 Years' War kind of brought us together in a sense. And it wasn't until the Americans tried a little bit more underhanded tactics at undermining our sovereignty, such as the influence of Lester B. Pearson and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, which began to change our conception of what Canadianness is into a much more American identity. So that was the changing of our flag, the changing of our national anthem, the changing of our official title as a country, the changing of the status of our Constitution, the adoption of an American-style Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Stuff like this, which paved the way for what Justin Trudeau calls post-nationalism. Canada, in his eyes, and in the eyes of Pierre Poilievre and the rest of the Canadian members of Parliament, Canada is a post-national state, where being Canadian is not descendancy from the United Empire Loyalists is not connection to the British Empire. It's maple syrup and hockey, which are about the most benign things to define an identity by as you possibly could get.
Yeah, we've had that
Yeah.
problem in very recently, when in England, where a English politician called, well, she's not English, a politician called Suella Braverman came out and said, actually, I'm not English and I can never be English because she is of Indian origin. And, fair enough, she just told the truth. And it caused a big meltdown over here where, the centre right and the civic nationalists were scrambling to explain how being English is just, liking cricket, drinking tea, eating fish and chips. And this was from our, intellectual centre-right people like Fraser Nelson, who were the editor of the Spectator, one of the largest right-wing papers in the country, who were using lines like a typical leftist. Oh, what exactly is English? It's like drinking tea and watching cricket and listening to Radio 4. It's hilarious because it's Canada, and it's one thing to undermine the Canadian nation, but it's another thing to undermine a country like England in that way, where it's literally that means the land of the Angles, the Anglolander. It's a very ethnic term. It's like the land of our tribe. It's I don't know how they can think they can do it and get away with it. And in Canada as well, I'm not sure how they can think and say that this thing of the idea of a post nation, as if the people before who came before don't matter at all. It's very, very concerning.
And it's as much as people I don't think seem to realize this, but Canada on average is a more conservative country than the United States. And almost all of the big, the big things that people are like, oh, Canada's a gay country because the prime minister goes to pride parades and, I don't know, you have a Sikh leader of a party. Almost all of these things are American imports. It's just our Laurentian. Laurentia is a part of Canada that spans basically what used to be Upper and Lower Canada. It's where all of the Canadian elites are from. The Laurentians adopt this because it's financially in their best interests to, because that's what America wants. But Canadian people, our number one concern is peace, order, and good government. That is what's talked about in our Constitution. That's how we behave. We don't have, Tommy Robinson style protests or, mass riots or anything like that, because it's unpeaceable. It's not how we are. We're not a very tumultuous group. We don't like disorder. We don't like war. We used to be the number one peacekeeping country in the world for this reason. And these are the things that really define Canadianness, is this kind of quiet, reserved conservatism where we don't make waves and we just try to keep to ourselves and continue, working for the empire and fighting Dutch people in South Africa or something, being tall. But that really is kind of what Canada is. And you don't see it because it's never really meant to be seen. It's hard to define, but it all has this origin. Every kind of weird Canadianism about being overly polite and saying, "Oh, sorry, all the time, that all comes back to the United Empire loyalists. And that's why I generally think it's almost impossible to divorce Canada from the monarchy or from the empire.
Yeah, wow, that was interesting to hear from an Australian nativist perspective, because, yeah, for us there is a bit more of that distinction, I suppose, between the nativist movement and imperial loyalism from really, the very first generations, where we had a very much a class divide between the native born, who were called the currency lads and lasses, and the British born, who were called the sterlings, which was this kind of, using the analogy of currency, you've got the real thing, the authentic Britons, and then you've got this sort of, the colonials. So that kind of conflict, or that tension was there from the beginning for us.
Well,
But I might turn. Sorry.
On top of that, I don't want to go on too long, but on top of that, that classified was really never a thing in Canada, because our most beloved governor generals were always British born. The first Lord of Vimy, Julian Byng, and Prince Arthur, number top governor generals of all time, both British born. All of the fathers of Confederation were British born as well.
Right. I did want to turn it over to Jerome and just see what he has to say about Empire Day from a native UK perspective, because I'm aware that in terms of the Brexit movement, which I think was obviously quite important for nationalism in your countries, and that was sort of one of the ways that populism, or the populist moment, was manifesting, I guess, in the British Isles through the Brexit movement and the desire to leave the European Union. But there was, during that time, articles coming out, and I think even politicians talking about, well, perhaps the UK can move into sort of a revived Anglosphere, or there was kind of appeals to that imperial nostalgia as opposed to European integration. So I don't know, is that something that's still going, or what's going on with that sort of conception, that sort of stuff in the UK, Jerome?
In terms of the populist movement?
Well, that and appeals to Anglosphere and Britain and its empire, as opposed, I suppose, to the continent. Is that something that's still being talked about, or?
So it's so complicated. So the situation is so fluid at the moment because of everything that's going on in Ukraine. So, okay, I'll take you back to 2016 Brexit, right? So obviously Brexit happens, and I think there's almost two wings to Brexit. And again, there's the elite wing of Brexit, and then there's the populist wing of Brexit. So the populist wing of Brexit was quite, to be honest, was just simply an anti-immigration vote. It was seen as a proxy in immigration. There was also the idea of perhaps a loss of sovereignty, a loss of control, not just over borders, but over all aspects of law, that our parliament wasn't sovereign. Again, this is hundreds of years that, it is the people represented in parliament have the power. So if you undermine the power of parliament, you undermine the power of the people. That was an important idea, but also just immigration as well. And also sort of the loss of industry as well was a big factor. But that's the populist view of it, wing of it rather. And then the elite view was the view that Britain was being stifled by a socialist state command economy Europe, that Britain was over-regulated because of Europe, and that Britain could strike out into the world and sign deals. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. Sometimes Europe it can be a little odious in terms of their regulation, and there's nothing wrong with signing deals. But obviously, that's where, with Nigel Farage as well, it came in to the idea of the Commonwealth. Now, the way I view the Commonwealth again is there's two Commonwealths. There's a lovely relationship with Australia and Canada. and New Zealand. We like them a lot. And then it's like there's the other Commonwealth, which is like Mozambique and Pakistan and Malaysia, which we're not so fond of. So, you know, and obviously the British government signed trade deals, I believe, with Australia, and Japan actually as well. But Australia, I think Canada, I think we did sign some kind of agreement quite quickly after leaving the European Union. The American deal is still ongoing. I don't know what Trump is doing about that. Who knows? So there were the two wings of it. You can see sort of the legacy of that kind of imperial mindset in Brexit, but it was not really the kind of the populist drive behind Brexit. It was more so the elite view behind Brexit, as in, you know, a particular right-wing elite view of Brexit. And, you know, obviously that view, I think some of the more hysterical right-wing Brexiteers were advocating for Hong Kongifying the Isle of Wight on the south coast of England, literally by bulldozing the entire island and making it literally into Hong Kong, and bringing all the Hong Kongers in from Hong Kong. That was one of the more crazy ideas from the Brexit, again, the elite right-wing Brexit camp. So you can see how that would be completely at odds with a kind of the nationalist and populist view of Brexit. But you can see that's the legacy of imperialism, as in, well, Hong Kong, of course, was the one of the jewels of the empire, along with, I would say, probably Singapore and the Suez Canal. You know, was one of the strangleholds of global trade that Britain was so proud to have, you know, take a hold of. And then that, so, but, you know, again, Hong Kong, for me, no, I've known Hong Kong Chinese throughout my life, and they're nice people. But at the end of the day, it's China, and we shouldn't, and it's full of Chinese people, and that's fine because it's in China. But we shouldn't delude ourselves that we can somehow maintain any kind of rule or any kind of anything over Hong Kong. It's a folly, and it's and again, it's just the imperial arrogance of it. That Britain, you know, again, the Opium War was mentioned tonight. 170 years ago, we crushed China, we raped them, we got 25% of their population addicted to opium, and we, you know, made their government so weak, intervened in civil wars which killed tens of millions of people. But the thing is, now the tables have turned. China is now, at least the world's second power, arguably the world's first power in some respects, in some metrics. No way can you push about China anymore. So the idea of maintaining this kind of arrogance over places like Hong Kong is just absolutely ridiculous, and that's the problem. And it is anti-nationalist as well, because at the end of the day, you know, we believe that, again, everyone should, every ethnic group, you know, obviously it's an ideal, and, you know, an ideal can be strived towards but never truly achieved. But every ethnic group should have their own patch of land, and that includes, of course, the Australians, the Canadians, and the New Zealand people, who are, of course, descended and closely connected to the people of the British Isles. But yeah, it's about people like, and then this is why you get into the Ukraine thing now, is that people like Keir Starmer not realised, and I still, and this is the legacy of the empire, have still not broken out of that imperialist liberal mindset. Tony Blair is a perfect example of it. Tony Blair started a war with Afghanistan. We poured 18 years, and America did as well, 18 years of blood and treasure, killed hundreds of British soldiers for nothing, absolutely nothing. We killed a hell of a load of Afghans as well for absolutely nothing. Because at the end of the day, the Afghans don't want liberalism. If you want to install liberalism in Afghanistan, you're going to have to kill every single last Afghan and replace it with, you know, white liberals from Surrey and, you know, New York City or whatever. It's not going to happen. unless you do a genocide, which again is not liberal, I suppose. And you know, now with Ukraine, Keir Starmer, I've just seen this ridiculous headline from The Economist, a once well-respected journal internationally, is now put up saying Keir Churchill, and it's Keir's face photoshopped onto Winston Churchill's body with the bowler cap and everything. Absolutely ridiculous. We were in no state at all to fight a war. We couldn't even fight a war with Iceland, you know, let alone Russia, for crying out loud. We have more. We have, I believe, at the breakout of World War II, Britain had, of course, the Royal Navy, of course, was the largest navy in the world. We had, I think, something about 350 fighting vessels, and today we have the 26, and only 2 aircraft carriers, and no planes to put on the aircraft carriers. Yet, you know, obviously we're an island nation, so you defend yourself with a navy. It's you know, this is, and I still the whole, you know, the rules-based liberal order, as they called it, but that is, you know, the legacy of the British Empire. That along with Woodrow Wilson, Britain was the first to do the whole, you know, liberal world order and use the empire as a cudgel, essentially. Oh, Germany can't invade Belgium. Why? In World War One, this is, well, or because of the international rules and but okay, but Britain has invaded, goodness, all the countries in the world. Where are the international rules then? I'm not even saying that's a problem, right? I'm not really. I don't really care. But you can't have it both ways. Germany can't invade Poland in 1939. Well, why? Russia can't invade Ukraine. Well, why? International rules. Why? It's the strong, and because when Britain was strong, look at with China, we absolutely raped them. China can't be mean to Taiwan. Why? Because when now China's strong, China can do what it wants. But that's the thing with our countries, is that if we want to do what we want, if we want to make the world the way we want to see it, we have to be strong. Can't be weak. Can't fall back on these stupid rules that was, you know, only relevant because Britain conquered its way across the world, made the world's largest empire in history, and then enforced its will upon the world. But we don't have the empire anymore. Don't have the navy. We have about a couple of dozen fighting vessels. Most of them are incredibly out of date. Can't do it. So a bit rant over there. Sorry. I'm not sure I've really answered your point there.
No, I mean, I think that was good. And it kind of, we are kind of riffing on a lot of the same kind of concepts back all the way from the Kipling poem. But yeah, we need to kind of refocus on our own affairs and our own strength, as you said, and get rid of this mentality that's a hangover of empire. That we need to go out and impose liberalism or whatever, or uplift people all around the world. We need to get rid of that, but perhaps we can keep the other side, the crimson thread of kinship that Grant mentioned. How are we all feeling, guys? I've got about 2 more topics on my brain that we could get into, but are we all happy to go a bit longer, or?
Yeah, no problem at all. Enjoying myself.
Connor?
In terms of let's just say on terms of kinship as well.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, we will always be brother nations, right? There's no, you know, we always will be. As long as we, you know, manage to win the national struggle, we don't get replaced by other groups of people. But even then, of course, it wouldn't be Canada, it wouldn't be Australia, without our people there. But we've got to think of a way in the 21st century, because again, you know, Britain, we lost the Suez Canal in the 1950s. You know, America dominates navally, is now threatening Canada. I'm not sure how serious those threats are, but you know, threat has been made.
Well,
obviously,
economically, they are real.
Yeah, the tariffs are very much.
It's part of that. Why I just wanted to quickly touch. It's like kind of what you were talking about in terms of post-Brexit, a lot of Canadians I know were hoping that Brexit would mean Kanzuk. Kanzuk is incredibly popular in Canada. Almost everyone I know supports it. And yeah, I think that's a leftover from kind of what I was saying a while when I talked in circles about was the need for an empire to be Canadian. Why Kanzuk is just beloved here.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think obviously, it's not. I don't speak for the party when I say this, but I would quite like to see a Kansas kind of, an Anglosphere federation, of course, minus the United States because I don't like them very much. No, but I would like to see some kind of future, definitely, intelligence and defense, you know, thing going forward. I mean, we almost had it in the post-war era as well, obviously. I'm not sure, maybe I'm slightly wrong here, but there were pretty much open borders between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain. Obviously, it meant that it was British people leaving mostly, but I'm not sure if I'm correct there. But that's.
I know until the 1970s, British citizen, as long as they lived in Canada for 1 month prior to an election, they were allowed to vote.
Goodness, there we go. Yeah.
The one risk with the Kanzuk arrangements, just really quickly, so Australia and New Zealand have a similar arrangement already, and New Zealand has really lax residency and immigration policies, and it basically, New Zealand is used as a backdoor to get into Australia for heaps of Pacific Islanders. So, like, from my point of view, that kind of arrangement, a Kanzuk arrangement, like our former Prime Minister Tony Abbott has recently made a written piece suggesting that this thing should be erected. I think really in the current state of affairs, it would be probably unhelpful because whichever country is the weakest link in the Commonwealth as far as immigration goes will just become the back door to flood the rest of our countries. Mm-hmm. So you'd kind of this Commonwealth agreement would have to come after total nationalist victory in like every country.
Yeah, it's a thing for the far flung.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, look, I think we've got a couple more minutes to go. We'll try to tie this off at 2 hours if we can. So I'll let Michael hook into the next topic.
Yeah, no worries. I thought we could briefly touch on, and it has been mentioned, the monarchy, perhaps starting with Jerome, because Connor, you talked about how important the monarchy is to, I suppose, Canadian identity, and in some respects, it plays that role to some extent in Australia as well. I mean, we've shot down one referendum already on becoming a republic, and a lot of the arguments made by the pro-monarchist side were the the stability that the monarchy brings to our system, and how it it ties us to our traditions and so on. So, but you might have a bit of a different perspective on it, Jerome, back in the UK.
So yeah, obviously Charlie III has been making waves on Twitter, but not the good kind, hosting a Ramadan iftar event in Windsor Castle, which obviously his late mother never did, and to be honest, I don't think she would ever consider doing it. But again, I guess she's not perfect, Liz, but she was of a different generation that had a different class to Charles' boomer generation. But that's this topic for another time. Look, monarchy is one thing. Personally, obviously in the party we allow all sorts of views on that. Personally, I'm a monarchist. I'm just not for the monarch at the moment. And let's be honest, throughout British history and English, and before that English history, monarchs and Scottish history as well, monarchs have been removed and replaced all the time for many different reasons. And obviously, most recently, Edward VIII in the 1930s for reasons that, again, are too long to go into at the moment. So, I mean, Charles better pull his finger out. Otherwise, I think, obviously we'll be asking someone else to take over the job. And again, that's not an anti-monarchy thing, because, again, it's just an I don't like Charles very much. don't think anyone really does. That's all I'll say on
No,
that.
fair enough. And I mean, if we look back at the origins of the British Empire, a lot of it was done under Cromwell. Funnily enough,
Yes,
so that was
yes,
the unity of the three kingdoms and some of the trade wars and overseas possessions that he gained. Prior even to 1688, which I suppose is an example of replacing a monarch when they got rid of the Stuarts and put in William of Orange. Glorious Revolution. But what do you think, Connor? Similar vibes or?
Now this is the thing. Well, obviously, I'm a loyalist, not a royalist. I think that's what Jerome was trying to say. That's the traditional way of saying it. Is loyalism is loyalty to the crown as an institution. Royalism is loyalty to a particular house or monarch. I'm not married to King Charles, but on a personal level, I'm not speaking for the whole assembly here as well, but on a personal level, I can't bring myself to hate him. I dislike things he does, but I too strongly feel like Charles as an individual is representative of our civilization as a whole, which to a broad extent is kind of exactly what you want out of a monarch. Obviously, in a political way, we want the king to stand up for us and to represent what we want, what we aspire to be. But in a sense, King Charles in his faults and, in, as Jerome alluded to, some of his boomerisms and whatnot, are quite indicative of a lot of the things that are going on in our civilization. And I can't help but detect a sadness in the king. I mean, in his interactions with those hikers, I don't know if you saw that video when they were cyclists. Those cyclists, they were cycling around this park and they bumped into the king. And I think broadly at this point in time, King Charles does represent kind of the loss of grace that our whole, British civilization has experienced. Which is why I can't bring myself to hate him too much. I think with that it's kind of what has happened to the British Empire. Well, you can see it encapsulated in a person. Now, on a more political brass tacks level, rather than a kind of weird poetic philosophical level, on a brass tacks level, obviously King Charles is not doing very good things for our nation overall, our nations, I guess. But at the same time, I fear that, for lack of a better term, counter signaling him too much, especially in Canada. Right now in Canada, we are at this very big crossroads. We have Canadians saying we should join the muck country of the United States. We have Canadians saying we should have a Canadian Republic, which, that would be just great. I can't wait to have Justin or Mark Carney as our president. Right now,
I could rag on Mark Carney so much because he has a legacy in Britain as well as Governor of the Bank of England. But again, that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah, but in terms of the brass tacks, right now, I think that counter signaling King is not good for Canada. because you introduce too much of an instability in that regard, ends the stopgap we have for total globalist liberal control of our country and our nation. Because at the very least, we still have the Governor General, which introduces more red tape for the Prime Minister to run away with the country. In Canada, it is, as much as people like William Lyon Mackenzie King have tried to reduce the power of the Governor General. The Governor General still does more to inhibit total prime ministerial control than I would say the King does, or the Governor General in other countries, to the best of my knowledge. I don't know. Maybe you could tell me about how the Governor General acts in Australia. But in Canada, at least, it does make things more difficult. The order in council to ban our guns was significantly slowed, and there were massive reductions on the extent which the Prime Minister was able to ban those guns because of the nature of the Governor General, which, as a president, he would not have those inhibitions.
Yeah, you still got guns over in we don't have access to anything. To be fair, you can get a shotgun license pretty easily in the UK, but you can't really get much else. Again, I don't own any firearms.
SKS. I have a firearms license, but what you can get has been significantly reduced. But if the Prime Minister were the president, we would not have guns at all. The Governor General will only allow the Prime Minister to do so much, which that is currently the best political stopgap we have from total liberal control, and that is why I have reservations about countersignaling the monarchy. On top of of course, as I mentioned, cultural aspects, of course, being that without the empire and the monarchy, there really isn't a Canada.
Yeah, interesting, because we do have the Governor General in Australia as well, as he said, like a stopgap. So one of our more liberal reforming Prime Ministers, Gough Whitlam, this led to a constitutional crisis in 1975, actually, for us. The Governor General dissolved his government and established a Conservative government, which was quite interesting. It wasn't perhaps entirely along the spirit of the law, but it did, I suppose, put the brakes on a little bit there in terms of some progressive reforms and things that were going on.
How does the monarch interact with your political system, or is it just the Governor General? Because, of course, in the UK, Charles meets with the Prime Minister, or the monarch meets with the Prime Minister every single week. They have a ceremonial, mostly ceremonial sign off on every single piece of legislation passed. And of course, they do actually play a fairly big role in UK diplomacy, as in, in the Foreign Office uses the royal family extensively for many different reasons. So I'm not sure, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, how does the monarch directly play a role in government?
Well, it's similar, but through the Governor General. So the Governor General essentially fulfills the role of the monarch for us, and they sign off on the legislation, and they do a lot of the head of state type diplomacy stuff as well. Of course, the royal family does a little bit of that for us, but primarily for you guys. But yeah, in theory, I mean, the Governor General is quite is recommended by the Prime Minister and so on, and it has to be, well, it doesn't have to be, but by custom it's an Australian that fills that role, and in theory there's not that much interference from the UK, but in practice, when we look at some of the stuff around that constitutional crisis, there was a lot of correspondence between the monarch's secretary and the Governor General of the time, and so there was still a lot of I suppose UK influence into what was happening with our politics. I don't know, Grant, have you looked into the 75 constitutional crisis that much?
No, not really. It's, I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire. That's all I would say. I mean, Goff deserved it, but at the same time, it was like pretty bold play. But I think that the real crux of it, I think, was the loss of supply, and he couldn't finance the government because the parliament rebelled, and so you just kind of had to pull the pin on it and call an election. It's kind of like to prevent a government shutdown. It's like the simplest answer, but there was probably other ulterior motives at play, which moved the people to cut off the supply as well. So.
Yeah, and as far as I know, it's similar in Canada. I don't know if you've had a constitutional crisis like that where the Governor General has used their powers to remove a government or whatever. But as far as I know, it's just
we did have one actually.
Yeah.
I alluded to it earlier. In the 1930s, in the interwar period, William Lyon Mackenzie King had a minority government with the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party had a minority government. He struck a deal with the Governor General because at this point in time, the Governor General, Julian Byng, so it's called the King Byng crisis. He had Governor General Julian Byng, the first Viscount of Vimy, who was a British nobleman. He was the Viscount of Vimy because he had led the Canadians to capture Vimy Ridge, a very important part of Canadian history. He had a deal with William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was a descendant actually of a Canadian Republican rebel, a man who led the Upper Canada Rebellion, William Lyon Mackenzie, and tried to install a Canadian Republic. But so his grandson, William Lyon Mackenzie King, had a minority government, so they struck a deal. If there was a vote of non-confidence, they wouldn't go to election to avoid voter fatigue. They would just install the Conservatives as the government. A vote of non-confidence came. William Lyon Mackenzie King tried to renege on the deal. The Julian Byng said, a deal's a deal, so he just installed the Conservative government, and then the entire Liberal caucus resigned. They could not meet quorum, so they called an election. And then William Lyon Mackenzie King came back into power because of voter fatigue. And then he went to the imperial conferences and had the British Parliament amend the Statute of Westminster to make it so the Governor General couldn't do that anymore.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I'll wrap it up in a moment, but just last thing before we finish off. It's been a really interesting discussion on my end to hear from you guys and what's going on in your countries. And I think we do have a lot of, shared interests and, shared problems as well in terms of both the positive and the negative legacies of empire and the crises that we face today because of that. What would you say, and I'll just turn to each of you in turn, are the sort of prospects for not just a renewed nationalism in each of our own countries, but perhaps a wider Anglosphere civilizational culture as well? Because in my view, and I don't speak for the entire Australian Natives Association by any means, but I'm of the view that there's need not be like a conflict between having a nativist culture and a national culture and a focus on your own nation and poetry and stuff, but also not an entirely globalist cosmopolitan culture, but a Commonwealth, or we can say old Commonwealth, perhaps limiting it to the white countries of the Commonwealth culture as well, just along the lines of our shared Anglo heritage. So what do we think are the kind of prospects for those two things, both the nationalism in your country and, I suppose, a renewed Anglosphere culture, or if that's even a desirable thing? Maybe I'll just turn to Grant first this time.
I guess I probably ranted about it for like 10 minutes before. I don't think those two things are incompatible. I think maybe the real question is not the kind of metaphysical cultural bonds, because I think those are just kind of organic and those crimson threads will never disappear, I suppose. The real question is, you know, if we are successful in retaining control of our own countries and reinstituting kind of nationalist interests, what kind of political allegiances and loyalties should exist between our peoples, given how close we are related by blood and culture and institutions and all the rest of it. And look, honestly, I think that's a very difficult subject. For me personally, there was a lot of interference in Australia's political heritage by the Crown and the British Parliament. So obviously I've ranted on previous podcasts about how our immigration restriction policies in the 19th century were not given royal assent, and basically we had to fight an uphill battle in order to have a white Australia because the British Parliament and the Crown didn't want one, because it would offend the billion Indians in their empire who as well are British subjects. But with that issue aside, I think it's probably a different story for Canada. It's been very interesting to hear how essential Britishness and loyalty to Britain is such a fundamental element of Canadian identity, as distinct from our own, because of our, I suppose, adversarial, and also it's like a family feud for us. It's like we're still family, but you've screwed us in a lot of ways. So we're loyal, and we're also kind of not happy about it as well in some ways. Different for Canada, obviously, but I think in the long-term game, when our grandchildren have successfully reinstituted a new nationalist order in our countries, that there would be at least a treaty of mutual defence and cooperation and peace, and I think that's at least the starting point as a minimum, between people that share such a common heritage and mutual interests, I suppose, in many ways. So long as the Brits don't get involved in another European civil war and drain our blood stock out of the country again, I think everything will be fine.
Try not to.
Yeah.
If Keir Starmer has his way, though, we might not be so lucky.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, that's all I'll say to that. Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
Well, yeah, like Michael said, in from the Canadian perspective, Canadian interests are imperial interests. So, Britannia leads, Canada follows.
Fair enough. And Jerome?
So, in terms of nationalism, Europe is way out in front of Britain at the moment, and that's not because I don't British people are necessarily not nationalistic. It's just because the nationalist movement in the UK for so long has been, quite frankly, retarded. Sorry for using that word on your podcast, but there's no other word for it really. Tommy Robinson and others, and the BNP was not great. But now with the Homeland Party, I think we're actually learning the lessons from what Europeans do. Now that Britain, perhaps obviously in recent talking about that adversarial relationship with Europe, but we're learning a lot from European nationalists, and I think, to be honest, there was a comment about grandchildren. I think, and I'm confident that we could get a nationalist victory within the UK within my lifetime, for certain, just because of the way things are developing on the continent and the way things are developing in this country. Obviously, again, there's something for another time, but the riots that happened last year shows you that there is of course, I don't endorse rioting, I endorse violence, of course. It was the wrong thing for them to do, but it does show you there is still that sort of fighting spirit amongst certainly large sections of the working class in this country, but also, there is a deep patriotism within the middle classes as well, although it is suppressed by economic factors, but it will come out one day. And what was the second part? It was nationalism and.
Oh, right. Like a revived, I suppose, Anglosphere culture. So maybe like a civilizational wide culture and not just a national one. Is that something that's desirable, or yeah?
I certainly think so. I mean, what we need to do is teach our young people to pick up a book as well and read and remember. Obviously, at the Homeland Party, we very much like Jonathan Bowden. I'm sure you guys have heard of Jonathan Bowden. If not, then I apologize. But he talks about that need to remember who you are. Go into the National Gallery in London. Go into read Shakespeare. See what we've achieved as a civilization and take that forward with us. And that, of course, can be spread throughout the whole of the Anglosphere as well. We just need it will revive. We need to teach our young people to pick up a book and read, which is easier said than done with the TikTok and whatever. People have attention spans, but it can be done, definitely.
Yeah, excellent. And interesting that you said remember who you are, because that was a big thing in our last podcast, and an article we read ended that way. So, which was about Banjo Patterson and culture, and it also included Empire Day. So we're all resonating, I guess, on the same frequency or something. Last thing is, where can we find your content, or what can we do to support you guys, just for both the Homeland Party and the Loyalist Assembly? So, Jerome, anything that our listeners can do to support you?
So, as Australians, if you want to become members of the Homeland Party, you can do. It's £36 a year. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's 2 to 1 the Australian dollar, so that would be 72 Australian dollars a year, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but yeah. So you can become a member. There's no problem. You can come to, if you're lucky enough to fly across the world, or you're in the UK, you can come to our events, national events, as a member. We've got an overseas officer as well, Martin, who is very good at managing. You can also support us, financially as well if you like, up to £500 per calendar year. But obviously, I'd like you guys to support your own nationalist movement before ours. Although again, you're welcome to support us as well. But the main thing you do as well is find us on social media, on Twitter, Homeland Party, on Facebook, on YouTube, Telegram, Instagram, and TikTok, all of them. Follow us there, like our stuff, share our stuff, steal our stuff as well if you like because we like our aesthetics. Borrow our aesthetics, use it. Don't worry, it's fine. Reach out to our media guys as well. Get involved. You can do media work for us and all sorts. But yeah, sorry, I went around on for a bit there, but happy to help.
We're grateful to have you guys on. So perfectly happy for you to share what you need. And Connor, Loyalist Assembly.
Yeah, well, we're like I mentioned in the very beginning, we're still getting our footing and whatnot, but we have a website, loyalist-canada.ca, and that will be updated with time about more information regarding what we're going to be actually doing in terms of on the ground stuff. But if you want to keep up with what we're doing more dynamically, at Canada Loyalist on X, formerly Twitter. We tweet periodically and comment on current affairs. Occasionally upload YouTube videos, and any YouTube videos we make is also posted on Twitter. X. I don't know, Elon Musk. But yeah, so at Canada Loyalist on X, or loyalist-canada.ca. There's no way to financially support us yet, but we're trying to make headway with that.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, and I'll wrap it up then. So to our listeners, let us know in the comments, that's on YouTube, what topics you would like to hear from us, or if there's a particular topic relating to Australia or the ANA that you'd like us to do a show on. And as always, I'd encourage all our supporters in the audience to make sure you like and subscribe, share our content far and wide. we'd love to share our show with as many good Aussies as possible, and even people across the ocean in other parts of the former empire, I suppose. And lastly, if you want to reach out and help, join up, support us, you can find us at ausnatives.org. That's AUSNATIVES.org. Signing off.